Hey everybody, today I'm here with my friend John Chafee. I'm really excited to have him on the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Kendall. I was looking forward to this. I seriously was for like a couple weeks.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
so great to hear. Yeah, so I just thought I'd start out with saying how I kind of got introduced to John. I met a lot of great people on Twitter, um, and my friend Mandy Capehart actually introduced me to his work, and I started following it, and I just loved it. And he's very gracious, and on his website he allows people to talk to him and schedule video conferences. So I did that, and it was amazing. And John is he's a ambitious guy. He has a podcast. He's written some books. What else do you do, John?
Oh, I'm just a misfit. Yeah. I'm also a part-time professor at Eastern University and its seminary. I teach spiritual formation there. But before that, I did church work and I did camp ministry stuff for like 20 years. And I saw some of the limitations that happen there, and I saw some of the glories and the good parts about it as well. But I think I found we're hitting. There's like a cultural thing happening right now where I think not that religion needs to evolve, but that we need to evolve in our understanding of religion, and that's really what I'm super fascinated by, because we can't discard it. We got to keep it, but we have to find a way to keep it and hold it today because it's no longer the 1500s.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. And along those lines, you recently wrote two books. I read them. They were great. And the first one is called Another Name for a Parable.
Yeah.
Do you want to explain that title, and also why did you write this book?
Yeah. Well, first off, the title, no one really knows this. It just makes me laugh. It really does, because I was sitting there and I'm like, man, I don't have a title for this book. What should I call it? And I was like, what's another word for parable? I was like, that's it. That's funny. So rather than trying to come up with an alternative title, it's like, oh, I'll just keep it as a question.
Oh, that's funny.
But the reason I wrote it is that it was actually kind of an accident. I just started maybe 6 years ago. I would read another philosophy book or theology or psychology book or something that was incredibly helpful and insightful for me. And at the time, I was working with middle schoolers and high schoolers. And I was like, I can't tell them about a 400-page book by Rene Girard. But if I can distill it into stick figures that I can tell as like a short, pithy story, I could do that. And I think I had finished reading Martin Buber's I and Thou, which is a fantastic book of philosophy, while I also had Pirates of the Caribbean on the TV in the background. And so I decided I want to see if I can write a parable that distilled the insights of I and Thou using pirates. And so that's actually the very first parable in the book. It's the pirate, the parrot, the parrot, and the compass. And so then it just kickstarted for like a good year and a half. Every time I write a book, I try to write a pithy little thing. And then someone said, you should just put them all in one place. And then I was like, okay, I'll just do that. And I put the best of the best in there. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's great. And, parables are very close to my heart because, I was an English major in undergrad, and, I love stories and fiction. And I think, I have such an appreciation for fiction and myths, parables, these kinds of things. I think it really helps kind of, we think in stories, so it puts us in the moment. It puts us in the story. It helps us think more holistically. I feel like, what would it feel like to be in this story? And, what is my emotions? What are my thoughts? And
Sure.
so I think it really helps us engage with it.
Yeah, and if you want to think of it like it's a technology, I mean, it's not a smartphone, but stories are a technology to disassemble a thought and reassemble it in a new way. And that's kind of what stories do. It's definitely what parables do. They take what you thought you knew, disassembles it and reassembles it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So, why are modern parables important? I mean, don't we have all the parables we need in the Bible?
Yeah. Well, yeah, you could say that. That's fine. But modern parables, do we need more of them? Probably, because we're in a new world and we're dealing with new things and we've made new advancements. But I think that there's two ways of approaching the Christian faith. Can I go like word nerd right now?
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
please do.
So most people understand Christianity from a soteriological perspective. So soter is the Greek word for savior or save. And so a lot of people approach Christianity in terms of how do we get saved? Okay. However, when you have a framework that has that as its main goal or value, then you overlook wisdom teachings. There's no reason to read the book of Proverbs. There's no reason to read the Sermon on the Mount then. However, if you come to the Bible or faith with a sophio rather than soterio, a sophiology, that means you're looking for wisdom. And there's no ceiling to wisdom. Like, there's never enough of it. And wise people would just want to keep growing in wisdom. And so, I don't know. It also has helped me to understand that there can be wisdom in other traditions too. That'd be very helpful. Without subscribing to a belief structure, be like, that's a really wise thing to say over there. And so I actually do think we're hitting a certain cusp. And I can reference spiral dynamics, but the idea is a lot of culture used to base its values off of stories. And then as the scientific revolution came around, we started focusing more of our life and structuring our lives on numbers and what's measurable. But what happens is you don't have values anymore. You just have numbers, because values can only be shared by story, which is a fascinating debate. You can interpret numbers, you can add up numbers, but how you interpret the numbers is dependent on your values, and that depends on the stories you tell yourself. So the world, I actually think, is aching for wisdom. It's like we have the internet at the touch of our fingers. We've got a surplus of information and knowledge, but we're completely lacking in wisdom. Oh, and here's another way of thinking about it too. In high school, Kendall, what studies do we have? What classes can you take in high school?
English, math, science,
Gym, physics, chemistry, right? The classics, what we would say.
Right.
Have you noticed nowhere in there is there any class devoted to just wisdom?
Yeah, it's all like knowledge and this is what you need
Yeah.
to know. Yeah.
It's all about retaining information. And there's no classes that teach you how to be a student and even how to be a mentor. And so there's something desperately lacking in Western culture that we don't know, or we don't even value the role of a mentor in the same way. We like coaches who do really good and get people to the Super Bowl, but actually a lot of the coaches' real power is in the mentoring that happens while teaching football. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's great. I think that gets into a whole other conversation that, this is great for another podcast, but just kind of our idealization of adolescence and staying young, and, old people, they don't know anything. They're not in touch with the times, and they can't teach us anything.
Right. But wise people, mentors, they would use their own life stories to pass on their own life wisdom to the next generation. And so I actually think humanity will always have a need for parables, for storytelling. That will never go away. Right. So it might look different. It might look like a Marvel movie. It might look like the Last of Us TV show. But all of these things are very abstract parables that we're slowly gleaning wisdom from.
Yeah, I totally agree. And even different art forms, music, art. I mean, it's they're telling a story in their own way too.
Yeah.
So
Uh-huh.
I'm all about the arts.
Oh, that's awesome.
That's great.
Yeah.
Have you read N's latest book, Curveball?
I
The Ends.
have it. I've only gotten 2 chapters in.
Okay. Ah, man, I thought it was amazing. But he kind of goes into how experience science. He even talks about near death experiences. A lot of these things that or quantum physics stuff that's kind of new and emerging, and talking about how we need to wrestle with these things and how they interact with theology and how we need to rethink theology and stuff like that using these things. So like you said, over time things change and our understanding of the universe changes, and that also affects our understanding of theology. So it's important to try to wrestle with these things. So
Well, and it's not just
yeah,
wrestle, it's about integrate.
right,
Bring them together. Yeah.
yeah. Would you say parables are sort of myth?
Well, it depends by what you mean by myth. What do you mean by myth?
Well, I guess it's just I'm thinking of their ways of talking about truth in a symbolic manner, and talking about eternal truth that applies no matter the time period or the age, whatever.
Uh-huh. Yeah, they can certainly touch on it. For me, there's kind of three categories to talk about when we talk about with myth, because there's history, which is strict fact, no narrative structure to it. Then there's saga, which is in the middle of the two. And then on the far side is myth, which is very symbolic, maybe ahistorical. And myth and parable seem to have some overlap, maybe not completely, but I think we organize our life in myths. And by myths, I don't mean untrue. And you already referenced this, but like the Bible is true, but we have to understand true can mean a few things. Like not only did it happen, it's an arrow can fly true. A compass can be true. Somebody's character can be true. So we have to figure out, like, does the Bible point people true? Does this parable point people true? Does this parable or this myth keep my internal compass healthy? It's like, yeah, this is a true story. But that's, I think, part of it. And as an English major yourself, you would already know that. Like, so much of literature depends on how we interpret it. But most people don't want to read the Bible as it's literature.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I took a class in grad school called the Bible's Literature, and it definitely made me very uncomfortable at the time.
Yeah?
But I
Why
was
is
like,
that?
well, it's because it was reading the Bible in its genre, and what does that mean? And, a lot of my beliefs were being challenged, and but I couldn't fault him. I was like, I was English major. This is what you do. You have to understand books in their genre, and that affects the meaning of what they're trying to say and the way we think about the story itself. So is ultimately really good for me, and I really appreciate that class.
And as a library of literature, even the books change genre within the Bible. So that's a tricky thing. It's a real tricky thing.
And undergrad, I was kind of referencing myth because I read The Power of Myth by Joseph Campbell.
Oh yeah, have you read
that
A Hero with 1,000 Faces too?
I need to. I haven't yet.
Okay, I'm sure they touch on similar things.
Right. But that was really powerful for me, really huge. And I love Campbell now. So
Yeah.
so I was wondering if you wanted to read one of your parables.
Sure. I'll read 2 of them. I won't read the last one because that one's really good. Even though it's
You'll have to get the book for that.
That's right. So the last section are parables with biblical references. So they reference like prophets or angels or Moses or something else. But this one I really enjoy. It actually. Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. The Shaman and the Great Fish. It's just before that section. And you're probably going to notice what's going on when you read it or when you hear it. Here we go. This is Shaman and the Great Fish. The shaman had enough. The unspoken resentment had finally hit its full crescendo, and it could not be hidden or avoided any longer. Exhausted and frustrated from praying to the god of the great river, the great fish, the shaman picked up his red spear and sought to hunt down the watery beast. Being the shaman had long since ceased to bring him favor or fortune. After 3 days of waiting on his canoe in the middle of the great river, the shaman saw the fin of the great fish rise above the surface of the water. Standing up on his canoe, the shaman readied his red spear and waited for the right moment. And as the great fish came close, it rose its head out of the waters and pierced the shaman with its gaze first. Friend, drop your spear, give up your quest to kill me. I am not your god, nor am I your enemy. You pray to me thinking that I need to be persuaded, appeased, or overcome. The reality is that I am in the world just as you are. I differ in size, but I'm a creature just like you, and there's a code that all of us cannot help but live and die by, a code that neither of us has written and neither of us fully can comprehend. The code is that of love and dignity and unity between all that is different. Utterly shocked at what he heard, the shaman lowered his spear. I've lived my entire life in service to you and the tradition that surrounds you. I've wasted my best years protecting the religion of you. Do not give up your practices, friend. They've brought you thus far, and it's time for them to take you further. That being said, you may need to redirect them. Recenter them on the one who holds us both in life and death. Your piety has served you thus far. Now it is time for it to blossom even further. I am less your God than I am a signpost pointing toward an even greater one. So, what I like to do, I've done a few events about this book, and I sit down with a group of people and I read one, and then I say, what do you think it's about, before I share my interpretation. And it's so fun because, like, I'll hear 5, 6 alternative interpretations, like, oh, I never thought of that, that was really good, I'm the one that wrote it, but man. So we actually bring a lot of our own personhood, life story to these parables, and there's no wrong answer. But as your first hearing of it, what do you think the interpretation or purpose of the parable is?
Yeah, it really reminds me of, I'm sure you know, Meister Eckhart. I pray God rid me of God.
Oh yeah,
and just that we, God is beyond our comprehension, and I think often we think, oh, this is who God is, and we practice our life around that image of God, and we protect Him, or some people are angry at that picture of God and they're fighting against Him. But there comes a time, hopefully, when you're like, oh, you know what, this is just an image of God, and there's some things right about it, but there's some things wrong about it, and it's time to grow and progress to a greater image of God, knowing that as we try to understand God more, we're still going to form images because we can't comprehend Him fully.
Yeah. Yeah, and even as you were saying that, I was thinking of, there's this quote I think it's from Richard Rohr. He talks about how mystery is not something unknowable. Mystery is something endlessly knowable. I'm like, you can always learn more.
I love that.
What I think is interesting, for me, that parable, it touches very heavily on what's called spiral dynamics, red and blue. Okay, and even purple. So purple, the color codes are different worldviews. And early worldview is called purple, or one of them, where there's a shaman and he's the holder of the tradition and he relates to the gods on behalf of the people. But he's tired of it. He's done. He's done doing the purple game. So he picks up his red spear, which is spiral red, when someone says, I will kill the gods and I'll become a god myself. So he goes out to the river to kill the god that he was living in slavery to, only to find out that that watery beast was already at like spiral dynamics turquoise, way higher. And they're like, buddy, don't kill me. This mystery is even includes me. I believe in something larger than even me. So I think that there's something to be said. Like, religion shouldn't be discarded because it feels regressive. It needs to be, the term is transcended and included. It needs to be reinterpreted. It needs to find its way to still give its gifts in the world that we have now. So it's not that we discard it, it's that we let it blossom. I think that's the word I used in there. We have to let it continue to evolve.
Yeah, wow, that's great. I love it.
Was that? I like that one. I've shared that with some other people, and they don't know what to do with it.
Well, I mean, it helps that I've really got into spiral dynamics, and your podcasts on them are also great. So, yeah, I think it's great.
But do you see yourself in that parable at all? That's the question. That's when parables take their coup de grace.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's funny though. Even as I hopefully continue to develop and feel like I see God in new ways. There's always the temptation to be like, okay, now I figured it out, and now I need to go shake everyone and be like, this is the way, this is who he is.
Yeah. I think that's one of the temptations too. There's a strong temptation to look down on people who aren't where we are.
Right.
But the reality is we were once where they are now. And that's a part of the path. Mm-hmm. So we always have to recognize if somebody is at an earlier stage of the path, that's okay. The only thing we can do is hold the door open for them when they're ready to walk through it on their own.
Right. And also there's so many facets to life where, in some respects, I might be ahead of someone in this way, but in other ways, they're way ahead of me in this way. So I think that just creates humility to, we're the learners and we're the teachers.
Yeah, absolutely. That's well worded. Yeah.
Thank you.
Should I read another one? The Nicodemus one?
Oh, yeah, go for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think the Nicodemus one is a little autobiographical. That's probably why I like it. Here we go. It's called Nicodemus Goes Back to Work, which is such a funny title. He gets up the next day. It's a Tuesday. All right. Morning came. The sunlight shattered through the window, and Nicodemus felt more alive than ever. After that riveting late-night conversation with the Nazarene, Nicodemus could barely sleep. His mind was racing, and all of his previous training made more and more sense than ever now that he saw what it was all pointing toward. With fervor and excitement in his step, Nicodemus washed his face, said his morning prayers, put on his robes, and headed out to meet his Pharisee brothers. They gathered on the street corner just like usual and talked about the tasks and duties of the day. But it all felt stifled, flat, uninspiring. Nicodemus stood there silently as they talked about the ceremonial cloths, the upcoming services, the choice of psalms for that week and the scriptures to be read, how to talk about raising monies for the temples, how others were misreading and disobeying the laws, and who most deserves to become a high priest next year. It went on and on and on. In the past, Nicodemus would have been fully engaged in the conversation. He would have been making points and counterpoints, feeling as though that was exactly what the Lord wanted him to do. But again, it all felt so small, confining, predictable. the conversation with the Nazarene changed everything. The previous night, Nicodemus was asked, "You are Israel's teacher, and you don't understand these things?" He felt foolish that he hadn't seen through it all earlier. But what could he do? He used to think the faith was all about what the Pharisees were debating right in front of him, but not any longer. All of these things are good and possibly necessary, but they are not an end unto themselves. It's about everything. It's about something so much larger than those things. The wind blows wherever it pleases, and Nicodemus couldn't feel the breeze under all those robes. And that's how it ends.
I love that. Just you feel that emotion, that the connection really gets you in the story. I think it's so easy to, we read the Bible, we grow up Christian, we read the Bible, and it can get stale if we don't see it anew and put ourselves in the story itself and color it, So I love that.
Personally, I love the final line. He couldn't feel the breeze under all those Pharisee robes. That's such, because the Hebrew and the Greek word for spirit also means wind or breeze, right. Not just breath. And I like the idea that sometimes tradition can get in the way of experiencing the breeze, the spirit. And so, I worked in church world and ministry world and camp ministry world for 20 years. And I know those conversations. They're week in, week out. What songs, what liturgical season is it, But when the tradition comes to be about protecting the tradition, rather than letting the tradition be how do we help people experience spirit, that's a completely different game. A completely different game.
Yeah. And even, of course I love, you love, and Pharisees love, talking about theology and discussing the ins and out of it. And that's important. And that's good. But it's like, are you living it? And, there's too much.
Yeah.
There can be too much.
Have you ever heard of, the way I talk about it, I forget what the name of it is called. I call it 3 ways of experiencing the sunset. Okay? The first is you notice the sunset, right? That it's better than not observing it. You're walking by and you're like, oh, it's a nice sunset. And then you just keep walking. That's just the first step. The second step is when you look at the sunset and then you explain, like, oh, it's orange and red and yellow because at that angle, the sunlight's coming through thicker atmosphere than it was at high day because of the angle of the curvature of the earth, and that refracts the light. So now I see it as this beautiful, deep red and cotton candy color, right? But that's the second level. The third level of experiencing the sunset is when you say, I am participating in the sunset. I am here with it, and actually it is actually observing me back. So there's like a mutuality. There's an intersubjectivity. And I hear a lot of theology and God talk as the second form of experiencing. We're talking about it. We're explaining it. It's fine. That's good. Maybe it's necessary to pass through that. But that's still not the same thing as actually experiencing it.
Wow. Yeah, that's a great way of explaining it. I totally agree. And, I can get caught in that myself and be like, man, this is starting to lose its flavor. It's like I'm just speaking words and concepts, and I'm not feeling it in my body. I'm not being like, oh, how does this actually work in life, and why am I even talking about this?
Right. Well, and that's what the word Catholic actually means. It breaks down into 2 parts, kata and halos. Halos meaning a whole, part or a thing, and then kata meaning concerning. So the one holy Catholic and apostolic faith means this concerns the whole of a person. This concerns the whole of everything. But we love to make it explicable so then we can control it so that we aren't surprised
Doesn't challenge
by it.
us.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. No longer challenges us. Yeah.
That's great. Well, do you want to move on to the second book?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, this is great because, I grew up Church of Christ, and we don't really, like I didn't even know what the word Lent was for the longest time.
Oh, yeah.
So this is, the subtitle is A Lenten Daily Devotional. So tell us, for those of us that aren't as familiar, what is Lent?
So Lent is the 40-day season leading up to Easter. It comes shortly after Christmastide, which is the season that comes after Advent. Most people don't know about that. Advent goes from roughly Thanksgiving up until Christmas Day. Then there's Christmastide, the 12 days of Christmas after December 25th. But then Lent starts with Ash Wednesday, and Ash Wednesday is the day in which we remember our mortality. But the 40 days are meant to be, it's called there's a special word for a something repetition. We're supposed to be repeating the experience of Jesus' 40 days in the desert, where we go through an intentional lack, an intentional deprivation of usual comfort so that we can in some way echo Jesus' time in the desert. But then it culminates with Holy Week, Palm Sunday, and then the events of Easter week, and then obviously Easter Sunday. So Lent is commonly understood to be a season of reflection and fasting and intentional trying to go into depths. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. After reading about it, I was like, oh, it's kind of like the Dark Night of the Soul. Would you say that?
Yeah, it's kind of like an intentional excursus through a dark night on purpose. Which that you know what? That's a great question. Why is it that some traditions avoid it then? Maybe they just want to be different from Catholic, But maybe, I mean, this is my opinion. I think a lot of people are very terrified of a dark night of the soul. Absolutely.
Don't blame them. It's tough.
This past Tuesday night, I teach a seminary class on Tuesdays, and we did a whole 3-hour lecture on the dark night of the soul, and we broke it down into the 4 parts of what's the process that happens. And we all agreed in the classroom that most churches keep people stuck in the first stage of the dark night of the soul and don't want them to go into stage 2, 3, and 4, which is where, according to St. John of the Cross, that's where real maturity happens. So, on another point, maybe we could talk about, I actually think a lot of our churches unintentionally are keeping people in spiritual arrested development. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
Yeah, but that's what Lent is.
Well, do you want to break down a little bit the 4 different parts? I'm really curious about what those are.
The Dark Night of the Soul?
The 4 different parts.
Yeah, you know what? That actually might go well with also what the Lenten devotional does with its themes. Okay. So most people don't know that The Dark Night of the Soul is written by a man named St. John of the Cross, who was a Carmelite. He was a member of the Catholic Church in the 1500s. And he was a young and idealistic guy. And so he went through seminary, and then he said, hey guys, I think we can do this better. Just shape it up a bit. And his Bible professors kidnapped him, threw him in a latrine, and they left him there for 9 months, giving him stale bread and only taking him out to beat him. That's his Bible professors. This is a latrine that was probably not large enough to stand up in, nor large enough to lay down in. So he lived a crouched experience for 9 months in complete darkness. He wasn't given paper or pens to write anything, but one of the ways he stayed sane was he would compose Spanish love poetry to God. And so he would write it in his head, remember it, and then recite it maybe millions of times over 9 months. And we believe that he got out of the generosity of one of the guards who left the door unlocked, and he bolted in the middle of the night. But then he left, and he started telling this poetry, and people started asking, what does this mean? And so he wrote a commentary on his own poem, and that's what I'm about to explain right here with the 4 stages. Okay. But it's really a love poem, and most people don't realize that. They actually assume the dark night of the soul is depression and doubt and angst and anxiety and hell. But it's not. But he says there's 2 parts of the dark night of the soul, and each of those 2 parts have 2 parts. Okay. The first pair is the dark night of the senses. Okay. And then the second pair is the dark night of the soul. It goes like this. Stage 1 is when we actively give up vices and sins, especially ones that, quote, are sensory, the dark night of the senses. We give up, just like in Lent, we give up sugar, we give up chocolate, we give up cake, we give up alcohol, heroin, we give up adultery, whatever. You give up all those things. And a lot of churches give a thumbs up of approval to people when they clean up their lives in that way. And that's good. They need to do that because their life is a wreck. And during stage 1, people start going to church, attend Bible studies, join a community. So those things are pretty good. And people usually get a sweetness. There's like a different senses. You give up certain vices and the sensation you get from those, and you trade them out for virtues and the sensations you get from living virtuously. But then comes stage 2, where we passively lose the sweetness of those things. Meaning, Bible study is like ash. Prayer means nothing to you. You don't want to go to church. Songs and hymns mean nothing to you. They don't activate you in any sense. You have no, quote, spiritual high anymore. You know, you're no longer on a mountaintop experience at every church service. Now you're just like, this sucks. Okay? And that's stage 2. And a lot of people, especially in American culture, are already in stage 2. But then they go to churches.
Deconstruction.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of people in American culture are actually then trying to go back to their church. They're like, they say to their pastors, I don't care about church or Bible study or prayer. All of it's ash. I don't care. I don't want to do this stuff. I get no high out of it. Am I no longer a good Christian? And if it's a bad pastor, they'll be like, you probably have unrepentant sin. You know? Or they might say, you know, the problem is you shouldn't be attending a Bible study. Now you should be leading one. And then make the problem even worse. So that's stage 2. And most people start to get worried when they start entering stage 2 because they think that they're losing the faith. But then comes stage 3, and this is when we shift into the dark night of the soul. Stage 3 is when we actively question the teachings and the instructions and the theology that we were handed. Maybe not completely. Maybe just like parts of it. Like maybe that part over there wasn't right. Maybe that was the opinion of my mentor or my pastor, but that's not what everybody says. And so people start to question their own theology, and especially the theology of their superiors that taught them. Now, if you go to your pastor and you essentially say things like, oh, I'm in stage 3, I question everything you've ever taught me, a pastor like that might be terribly insecure and be like, you are losing the faith. You're no longer one of us. I know how to interpret Christianity. You've lost the way. And people further walk away from the church. I think a lot of people in the deconstruction movement probably passed through stage 2 and are already in stage 3 of the dark night of the soul. Okay. And then here comes stage 4. And this is where the big punch is. 3 is when we actively give up teachings that we no longer think are helpful for us. That Meister Eckhart quote of I pray God rid me of God. Stage 4 is when we passively lose the sweetness, not of worship music or prayer or Bible studies or community, but of faith itself. And this is when somebody functionally feels like they're an atheist. My God, why have you forsaken me? I feel nothing. This is Mother Teresa of Calcutta in all of her journals for 40, 50 years when she said, I experience darkness. I have nothing when I pray to God. I feel nothing, but I'll still living in service. But the real task, the thing that's happening in the dark night of the soul, is at every single stage, different idols that we prop ourselves up with are being taken away. So for instance, you're no longer, stage one, you're no longer allowed to be proud of what vices you've given up. Stage two, you're not allowed to be addicted to the sweetness of being close to God rather than God himself. Stage three, you're no longer allowed to be proud of how certain your theology is. Which is like, I'm like, oh my gosh. Stage four, you're not even allowed to make an idol of your own faith. If you're putting faith in how much faith you think you have, that's still putting faith in the wrong things, which is still an idol, even though it sounds pious. So if you wake up on a Tuesday and you're like, man, I've got so much faith today, and then on Wednesday you're like, I got nothing, it doesn't matter. Because on both of those days, you're making the mistake of putting faith in how much faith you think you have. And so when all these crutches are taken away, when all these supports are stripped bare, there's nothing left to do except to fall. And then you fall into the hands of God, and then you realize, oh, God's been faithful all along, even though I had secret idols the whole way. And so the Dark Night of the Soul is really a romance poem about every false lover is taken away from you, no matter how pious they sound. John of the Cross probably went through all four of these stages while he's in a latrine, while being beaten by his Bible professors in complete darkness, probably saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Literally. Mm-hmm. And then he comes out on the other side being like, God is good, not because of anything any of us have ever done, but solely because of the unconditional love that sustains me even through my supposed atheism. Wow. So for me, I'm like, oh, the Dark Night of the Soul is utterly brilliant. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, when I worked in churches, I was actually told I wasn't allowed to teach it. I'm like, why? This is beautiful stuff. But to the ministry machine, once people enter stages 2, 3, and 4, most ministry machines have no idea what to do with them. And unfortunately, John of the Cross says, be careful who you talk to about the dark night of your soul, because unless they've gone through it first, they will give you bad advice, and they'll just tell you to run on the treadmill of stage 1 harder.
Wow.
So, first thoughts, how does that sound to you? I hope I didn't word vomit too much.
No, that was beautiful. That was great. And I could just say, that feels accurate, feels familiar. Have you read or heard of Jim Marion, The Mind of Christ, that book?
Yes, I have. I actually have it over here. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think he goes into the synthesis of spiral dynamics and the dark night of the soul and kind of that whole spiritual journey and path. And, I think we both love to see models of, spiritual growth and what that looks like and how it can progress to that, and kind of just a model to look at to help.
Yeah. To be honest, I actually shared this over Zoom early on in COVID. And it was just a small class. There was maybe like 15, maybe 20. And there was a mother there, and she was quiet the whole time. She was a mother of 4. All of her kids were under 7 or 8 years old, so she was swamped with life. But she was quiet, and she was locked in. Like, it was almost as though for the whole hour we were talking through it, she didn't even blink. And at the very end, she spoke up and said, John, this was one of the most helpful faith conversations I've ever had. I said, well, why? thank you so much for sharing. She said, because this whole time, for years, I thought and I was made to feel like I was losing faith. And you just told me I've actually been maturing in it. And it utterly reframed it for her. And she said, this was the best hour and a half I've spent in years talking about faith. And to me, that's why the tradition is so much more wild and wise and beautiful when you scratch beneath the surface and you figure out what some of these best saints and hermits and mystics and holy sages say. You're like, oh, I was told all these people were dangerous. But they're really just dangerous to the status quo. These people are actually incredibly liberating when you actually learn what Augustine really says about sin. Okay? What Julian really meant when she said, all will be well, all will be well. You start realizing this is actually where the Christian faith is. It's not on the Barnes & Noble bookshelf of books that were written in the past 20 years. So I've become more of a historic Christian, but I actually feel like it's a strange thing. I feel as though I fit in less, but I feel more Christian than ever.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, I mean, that whole journey really connects with me, and yeah, it connects with so many, deconstructing and, trying to find a more or true and authentic faith. So really appreciate that. One of the themes you talk about, and this goes along with it, is the importance of silence and reflection. And I was reminded of a book I read actually freshman year of high school called The Chosen by Chaim Potok. Have you heard of it?
Oh yeah, that's not the same thing. I've read My Name is Asher Lev, and I think The Gift of Asher Lev. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay.
But
I haven't read The Chosen.
It's about a Hasidic Jew in New York, and his dad actually didn't talk to him for like I can't remember, but a couple of years, and talked to his brother, and obviously that was very hard for him. And you can debate the ethics of that, but he was teaching him the importance of silence and how God sometimes feels silent to us and what we can learn from that. And man, that has really stuck with me.
The silence of God.
Yeah.
Why is that a theme that stands out for you? What's the reason?
Well, I think, kind of it's like sometimes we need to lean in and it's like a drawing in maybe, or just like all the things that we thought were ways God was talking to us no longer work. And so it's like he's drawing us deeper into that relationship. And so it's like, what is this relationship developing into? What does it look like to have this relationship? So, and through that, God will again start talking, and it'll be a richer relationship than before.
Yeah. Is it Martin Scorsese? He did a version of the movie Silence by Shusaku Endo, and I watch it every Good Friday. It's about two Jesuit missionaries to Japan, and what do they experience when in the face of persecution there's just utter silence from God in their prayer life. I think it's one of the best movies I've ever seen, like hands down. If you haven't read it,
I've heard of it. I want to. It's buddy. On my list.
Oh man, I think if you can, it's a long movie. It's 3 hours, and if you can sit down in a dark place and watch it straight through, it's almost impossible to finish the book or the movie called Silence without saying, "I need to talk about this with someone." And it's so wonderful to me because it doesn't do what American evangelicalism sometimes does, which is try to make the faith triumphant. And this is not triumphant in that way. This is a weak faith. This is a faith that's like grounded in reality, and it looks at suffering And it really is. That's excuse me. That's why I like to watch it on Good Friday. I think silence in I actually talk about it a number of times in Echoes in the Desert is our lives are dominated by hurry, noise, and crowds. And the only three antidotes to those things are silence and stillness and solitude. And if your life is dominated by hurry, noise, and crowds, you should just expect that you will always have a shallow faith. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I went through a period where, well, I still do a lot. When our car is traveling places, we're listening to music, whatever. But I just stopped, and that's really uncomfortable at first.
Yeah, it is.
But just sitting in that silence. And now a lot of times I listen to podcasts, but still sometimes. And I mean, it's actually very enjoyable. It's like take a breath. Reflect.
Yeah.
And,
you're actually letting the CPU of your brain catch up its processing. It's like there are files that are waiting to be downloaded or files that are waiting to be converted, and your brain finally has a chance to do that.
Right. Oh, and another thing you said about that you start going into the Beatitudes and talking about those and how you really explain them well. I think in that it's not so much about blessed are those who have achieved this certain state or a way of being, but it's about those who are trying and they're also suffering. It's like blessed are those who are suffering and who are broken, and it might not always look great or but I see their heart and I see their effort, and that's what's so important to me.
So like, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. It doesn't say blessed are they because they're doing the right thing now. Blessed are they because they just want it, man. They don't know how to do it. Their life is a wreck, but at least they wish they could. And what I like about it, I mean, the good news has got to be good news for the people on the bottom. If the good news is only good news for people on the top, that's just the usual status quo, man. That's what life already is. And so I love the idea that the gospel is about taking the pyramid of power and inverting it.
Yeah. Oh, man.
The pyramid of favor and blessedness. Yeah, and inverting it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just think so many times I've seen in Christian circles, like, people who are broken and like, I need help with this. And then the people in charge are kind of like, it's like, oh, they're the project. They're the ones that need looking after. But it feels so disingenuous because it's like the leaders are acting like they have it all together, or they have the answers, and
right.
Man, it's like those people actually might be further along the faith journey because they're questioning, they're thinking, they're struggling, where they're being more authentic about themselves and what they're going through than these people in power who are more putting on an image.
Right. Well, and if you think about, all right, let's think about a pharaoh over Egypt. He's at the top of a pyramid. The only movement you can do from the top is down. And he doesn't want that. So he's going to fight intensely to stay at the top and to maintain the public narrative that he should be at the top. So that's one of the beautiful things about Christianity, is that it takes people at the bottom and it gives them a voice, because there are some truths that can only be said from the bottom, not from the top. Which is, that's the prophets were always on the fringes. Amos wasn't even a priest. Amos was a farmer. And he says it. He's like, guys, I just rake and I hoe fields. And from out here, I know what God's trying to say, and you guys still can't hear it. You're like, wow. There's something really funny about Amos, just real fast. Like, God speaks to Amos and tells him to say to the people, away with your festivals and services. I hate your noisy worship. But let justice roll down like a mountain, or like a river from on top of the mountain, right? I can picture Amos hoeing in the fields, and he hears the worship music in the temple
Mm-hmm.
just a few, or the synagogue just like a half mile down the road, and be like, God, those people are annoying. He's like, man, it's like, do they not see the injustice happening a half mile down the road that way? And they're over there singing in their synagogues. So
Mm.
I don't know, man. It's a spirit comes and goes where it will, and it won't be
Mm.
confined to just the top of the pyramid. Won't be confined to the people that have the robes or the degrees or the titles. And so that's the Jesus movement is really glorious and surprising and subversive and rebellious and holistic and Catholic in its original sense. And like I understand in modern culture, we might say there's no need for parables or just to do something for Lent. But I don't know what it's like for you. But the more I study what ancient Christianity is, the more I'm like, oh, this really is one of the most beautiful gifts to humanity that's ever happened. It's just a shame
Yeah.
American culture has made a mutation of it.
Right. I think I was just talking to a student who's getting her degree, master's degree in early Christian studies, and how it's so freeing the more we learn about early Christian history and the diversity of views and the discussion, and before things got so settled on, this is heresy, this is not, and
Yeah.
just a freedom to discuss these things and consider these things and have alternate ideas and views, and there's just such a richness to the whole history.
And one of the things I wanted to do in the Echoes devotional is show how a lot of the passages that we read in the New Testament have echoes that started in the Old Testament. So, for instance, I'm not sure if you've gotten to the part, maybe you've read ahead, I don't know. But
I finish it, that one.
oh, okay. Jonah is asleep under the bow of the boat during a storm, and he's suicidal. He's like, guys, just throw me overboard. It's because of me, right? But he won't kill himself because it's against Jewish religion. But he says to them, just throw me overboard, and that will appease Yahweh. But then you flash forward to the New Testament, and Jesus is asleep under the bow of the boat during a storm. And he comes up, and he's not suicidal. He's the opposite, where he's like, oh, everything's fine. They're like, what? We're about to die. And then he doesn't call out to God because he is God. He just raises his hand. The storm stops. And then it's so remarkable. The disciples then are more terrified of Jesus than they were of the storm. They say, who is this that the wind and waves obey even him? There's a very strong reverence. But I think that's part of it. Like, many of us were taught the story of Jonah and the whale. And that's only one of 4 chapters of the book of Jonah. It's not even the main part of the story.
Right.
And when we've been handed a Christianity that doesn't make those connections, of course we're going to say it's pretty easy to debunk it. But and here's a thought for your literature background too, right? Conservatives will read the book of Jonah and say, this must have happened because it's historical. If it didn't happen, there's nothing to learn from it. Obviously, he was swallowed by a whale. In Hebrew, the phrase is hadag hagadol, which means large fish. Liberals might go the other direction and be like, this never could have happened, so this story is stupid. No reason to read it because it's ahistorical in their worldview. But to the person that actually values Christianity sociologically, we might say, I don't care if it's literal or not, because the real story is, do you know how to go and preach repentance to your oppressors? Because Jonah had to go preach to the Assyrian Empire, who were the worst people to Jews. And so he's also preaching across racial lines, economic lines, oppressive lines. And so as long as we're debating the historicity of Jonah being swallowed by a whale, we're not really getting around to the point of, do you know how to love your enemies?
Right.
And are you okay if Yahweh even chooses to be good to them too? That's what the book of Jonah is really about. But we've shrunken it down because that gets too close to the nerves. So let's just talk about a whale.
Right.
So I wanted to make
Yeah.
some of those connections. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. One part I really love is when you talked about Jesus and you said he not only shows us what it means to be more divine, but also more human, and that they're not exclusionary things.
Right. Yeah. So a lot of us were taught an either or dichotomy of I need to be either human or be divine, not realizing that to be human is to be divine because the divine became human. Like you follow the logic, you're like, oh my gosh, I see it now. But that's kind of a critique against the Christianity that says the best way to be holy is to escape being human. No, the issue is if you want to be holy, you need to learn how to be properly human. So why not learn from the most human one?
Yeah.
I think that's beautiful. That's
Yeah,
game
that is
changer.
beautiful.
But
Yeah.
what
And
made
it
that one
connects
stand
with-
out for you though?
Yeah, I mean, just makes it more relatable, and I think Jesus calls us to be like him, and he tells his disciples you do even greater things, and I think sometimes we can be so busy worshiping Jesus that we're not trying to be like him, or we're it's almost like I mean, I think it's good intention trying to be humble, but then we almost hold ourselves back in what God can accomplish through us.
Right. Absolutely. And then we take Christianity and we make it into a spectator sport where we're like at a soccer stadium. We sit back and watch Jesus score all the goals. I mean, maybe if you want to stretch the analogy further, he's more like the soccer coach. He's Ted Lasso, who like believes in us and actually thinks that we're capable of being good people. And then, I don't know. I've long since shifted out of that worldview that says that we sit back and we let God save the world, not realizing God wants to save the world through us.
Yeah.
Following in the footsteps of the Soter.
I love it. And it kind of goes into the next thing about you really go into rhythms and seasons, and you talk about desert and forest. I've heard all your stuff, so I know you like the Franciscans and St. Francis and the focus on nature, and it's all very grounded. And I mean, I love nature, and I feel really connected to God and nature. And it's so easy in our modern day to get disconnected from nature and these rhythms and these seasons. And I mean, I definitely think it does a number on our health and mental well-being, emotional, all that stuff.
Absolutely.
And I remember one time I was inside and I was worried, anxious, thinking about all these things. And I just walk outside and I see the vastness of the sky and just the difference of being inside and your world is so small. And then you get outside and you're like, oh, it's so much bigger. And you hear the bird chirping and you hear nature and it slows you down. You're like, oh, life is so much bigger than my little problems. And I just need a bigger perspective and to feel nature and how it works. And that's so soothing and grounding.
Absolutely. And I think that there's something naturally calming about the color green. You know? And if you think about it, no one paints the inside of their house green, the walls. But we have to put plants in our house, and usually people have like 2 or 3 plants at a time. But we used to live surrounded by green. And that's not what we do anymore. So I think that you're right. There's some holistic health that happens.
Yeah. And then I appreciate how you then talk about how sometimes cycles, seasons can become unhealthy and how we need to break them. So again, that spiritual journey, that a call to greater faith and more nuanced or whatever. Yeah,
a good dichotomy, another rhythm you could say, is fasting and feasting.
There you go.
American culture loves to feast, and so we don't know how to fast. But then you could be a type of person that maybe has a scarcity mindset, and then you overindulge in fasting, you forget how to party every so often. You know?
Right. I think people forget that Jesus also went to parties and he enjoyed himself.
Yeah. Well, he also made parties happen. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, right. So that also tells you something. That means that for Jesus, holiness is not a matter of avoiding parties. So, here's a great one. Have you ever? Now my brain is just getting excited. In John chapter 2, when Jesus makes water into wine, he uses it. He uses jars. Do you remember the story? And there's 6 jars, and so he fills them with water and he turns them into wine. It actually says that those jars were originally meant for purification services, for mikvahs, for baptisms. And so a great critique that I heard once, I'm not sure where it was is your understanding of the faith more based upon purity or around enjoyment? And if your faith system is still based in a purity-based worldview, it's not bad, but at a certain point your faith needs to be transformed like water into wine, and you have to realize that faith is not really about purity, it's about enjoying life deeply, meaningfully, and truthfully. Yeah. I thought that that's really fascinating. Jesus looks at purity things, and he's like, yeah, we're going to use this for a different purpose.
Yeah, I love that. Wow. That makes me think of, your also faith, your journey being about fear and, I shouldn't do this, versus what should I do based on love and the outflow, that relationship I have with God and that love, and then the outflow of that to others.
Yeah. Have you ever heard that section from Philippians 2 for one day every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord?
I was actually getting to that. I was like, do you want to talk about your final theme of the book?
Let's do it then. Let's just jump to that.
That's great.
Say more. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to open it up to you,
Okay. All right. Well, here's the thing. Is I think that Christianity, real Christianity, is hidden in all the passages of the New Testament that we avoid. I think that there's a lot of singular passages that when you read through it, your brain just wants to skip over it because you're like, that changes things. But then when you start highlighting them and you put them all together, you're like, oh, this is a very different thing happening. So, for instance, I remember being in seminary and we were sitting in a class and we were reading through Romans, and we got to Romans 11:32, where it says, there's different translations of it, but God saw that all were disobedient and so has chosen to be merciful to all. I remember being like, wait, what? Why does it say all? What does all mean? God's merciful to all? What the hell does that mean about hell? We never talked about it. I'm like,
literally, what the hell?
Yeah, right. And I remember thinking, this is crazy. But I always kind of kept it like Mary. I pondered it in my heart alone when nobody was around. And I started reading other passages. I got to like Acts chapter 3, verse 21. Peter says something starting in verse 19. Repent and turn from your sins that favor might come from the Lord, that one day after he has been received in heaven for long enough, Christ will return for the restoration of all things, as foretold by the prophets of old. And the restoration of all things, it's like that word all again. I'm like, what's going on here? And what does that mean? Everything will be restored. Everything will be fixed. Everything? What's happening? And no one would ever read that passage. On Pentecost, we read Acts 2, but we don't read Acts 3. And we never pay attention to the fact that the book of Acts never says the word hell. Neither does Paul in all of his literature. Neither does John's gospel or his letters. Like, what is happening? And the fascinating thing is the phrase restoration of all things, and then I'll get to Philippians, is this word apokatastasis, which means a return to original stasis, a return back to where things were. It actually originated as an astrological term referencing the moon, which is fascinating. The moon has an orbit, it leaves, but then it comes back to its original position. And the idea is that in Christ, all things will be returned to their original position. And I was so fascinated because it's Peter in that moment saying, as foretold by the prophets, which means for all the doom and gloom and damnation and conviction of the Hebrew prophets, Peter still, on the whole, was like, yeah, they're about restoration, not damnation. Like, this is the first pope of the church. Why aren't we talking about this? And then I came across other passages such as John 11:32, when the Son of Man is lifted up, he will gather or drag all people to himself. Drag is the word there. It's the same verb that's used for fishing nets, which is beautiful. There's 1 John 2:2, for we know that he is the Savior not only of our sins, but for the sins of the whole cosmos. Like, what? Then you read other passages, 1 Timothy 4:10, where it says, for we know that Christ is the Savior of all people, especially those that believe. Why does it say especially? What's up with that? It's because to be a Christian means that you're in on the joke early. You know the punchline's coming. Everybody, it's like, I mean, it's kind of cool when you're at a party and you know somebody's telling a joke, you're like, this is going to be such a sweet payoff. And then they tell the punchline, you're like, yeah, it was so good, you know? But then when you get to Philippians chapter 2, when it says, therefore let the same mind be in you as was in Christ Jesus. The Marian book talks about that verse quite a bit. One day every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. The word for confess there is a Greek word exomologeo, which means this. It doesn't mean confess. It means to openly and joyfully profess without reservation. There's not one sense of like, shucks, didn't do it in time. And why is it above the earth? The angels have to do it on earth, us, and then under anybody that's already died or in potential punishment or holding. Why is it that no one has a negative sense of like, shucks, Jesus is Lord, I missed the boat? Because the early church, and I say it in the Lenten devotional, especially on Holy Saturday, the early church understood Holy Saturday as more of a jailbreak. The day between Good Friday and Easter, Christ descended into hell to harrow it, to lay it flat, to bust down its gates, to set the prisoners free. We say this language all the time, but we don't actually mean it because we say it like liturgically, not actually in reality. And I love the idea that at the end of everything, everyone will openly and joyfully profess without reservation, oh, God is love. And in love, there is no exclusion or shame or blame, but only restoration, reconciliation, redemption, renewal, reclamation, reparation, and rescue. I've come to use those R words. They summarize the gospel for me because I think previously in American culture, I kind of fell into that line of like, oh, salvation's a private thing, which is true.
Individual,
but actually it's a cosmic thing, which includes the individual. Transcend and include, baby. So when I came across all these passages, and then you can do the same thing in Romans 5, for we know that in Adam all die, but in Christ all will be made alive. You're like, why is it that we don't talk about these passages? For it's not that the sacrifices of bulls could do anything repeated, for Christ's sacrifice was done once, timely, for all. I mean, once for all, and that's a numerical reference. I really think that what we have in America is a very far mutation from what early Christianity used to be.
Right, yeah. Because was that a lot of early Christians? They were Universalists, right?
For the first 500 or 600 years, yeah. And then there were some followers 200 years after Origen who really botched it, and
Mm-hmm.
they were excommunicated for how they interpreted Origin, and then he got dragged along with them. But here's the thing. Their teaching was discredited or excommunicated because they said all people will be restored because all people have existed since eternity. Like there's a pre-embodiment of the soul.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But actually, Gregory of Nyssa, the Cappadocians, Julian of Norwich, okay, George MacDonald, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Soren Kierkegaard, C.S. Lewis, Billy Graham, all of these people came around to be like, oh, the restoration and rescue of everyone and everything, the entire cosmos is going to be apokatastasis, brought back to its original position because God is all of our Alpha and Omega. What's fascinating is all those other figures have never been considered heretics. They're always considered saints, and they believed it.
Yeah.
So, I once had a.
Yeah, that's great.
It's so beautiful. It changes everything, and here it also changes Christian ethics, because then your motive to be healthy and holy isn't out of fear of being punished or excluded. Now, the only reason to be healthy and holy is because it's out of gratitude and because you actually believe it helps me to not lie anymore, to cheat on my spouse, to covet my neighbor, to actually keep the Sabbath. It just reframes everything. Reframes
There's such a lightness and freedom to it, but also, yeah, I mean, joy and it's like, oh, I don't need to go out and save my neighbor and get these numbers and
right.
I think it makes you kind of devalue a person. It's like an achievement, like, oh, I got to save their soul, or it could be just concern for them, but it's like, there's certain things that we can obviously help people grow in, but it's like everything will be okay in the end.
All will be well.
Release that fear.
What's beautiful is it kind of gives other people the autonomy to come to Jesus in their own time. There's no impetus to force or coerce or to convince them on your time schedule. Because sometimes I'll have conversations with people and they're like, I don't like Jesus. I'm like, okay. But in the back of my mind, I'll be like, it's okay. One day you'll see God is love. It's okay. I don't need to be perseverating over you because I'm not even your savior anyways. So
it is so funny because so many people are like, oh, like we can't save people, only God can. But yeah, it's like, do we really believe that? Because we're trying really hard.
Right. But then the gospel becomes reframed. It's no longer come and follow Jesus and you'll be saved. Now it's everything is being fixed in Jesus' name. Do you want to be a part of it? And it becomes an invitation rather than something else. And I think the world has got enough people condemning the world. We need some message out there that says this world is still worth being redeemed, fixed, healed, mended.
Yeah, that kind of goes into the kingdom of heaven. It's coming, but it's also now. And I think that you could do the same thing with like, oh, hell, or, Gehenna, whatever. It's like, if you aren't living by the fruits of the Spirit, then you're going to suffer here on earth. Hell on earth.
Yeah. And, one of the most common debates or let's say questions people have about the restoration of all things in Jesus is, well, that means everybody's going to get in. I'm like, yeah, what's the problem with that? I have a quick story about that too. But some people say, so it doesn't matter how I live. And I said, no. Actually, it says in Romans 2, everyone will be held accountable for what they have done. The Jew first and then the Gentile. Which means everybody will get in, but you're going to get a pretty strong talking to. And I think that there's something to be said a lot of times in the New Testament. So like the parable of the sheep and the goats, where it talks about the goats will be sent off to everlasting punishment. The word everlasting is actually in Greek, it's the word aionion, which means era. That's not everlasting. That's like a season.
Mm-hmm.
And then the word for punishment doesn't mean punishment. It actually means correction, curtailing, and even pruning. And so all the goats that didn't turn their lives around, they didn't know how to live out of compassion, they're going to go through a season of pruning so that they can look like a bush that's like healthy and whole and sprouting blossoms like it should. That's a very different gospel than to say, turn to Jesus or you'll be punished forever.
Mm-hmm.
But we're dealing with a divine gardener, and that's so much more beautiful of a gospel.
Right. It really reminds me of the story in Chronicles of Narnia of Eustace and the dragon. You know, he puts on this gold thing because he was greedy, and he becomes a dragon. And then Aslan finds him, and Aslan is scraping all the scales off of him with his claws, and it's so painful. And he's crying, but underneath, he's himself.
Right.
He's
the true Eustace.
The true Eustace. There you go.
Yeah. That I've never connected those two. I'm going to use that from now on.
Yes,
that's so good. The dragon scales. I forgot about that. Mm-hmm. And there's also a beautiful line in the last battle. They're in the heaven scene, and so they're ascending. They're going onwards and upwards, right? And they're there, and they come across a man who looks very confused. He's a soldier. And he's looking around. He's like, where am I? They're like, oh, you're in Aslan's home, or something like that. And he says, I never knew Aslan. I knew Tash, or Tash.
Mm-hmm. The devil figure. Yep.
The devil figure. He's like, I always lived my life in service and goodness and hospitality to Tash, not to Aslan. Mm-hmm. And then Aslan says, beautifully, everything
I attribute you these things.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah. Say it.
I attribute these things you did for him to me because the image you have of him was of me.
Oh, it's so good.
Yeah.
It's sneaky. Yeah. So there's also I forget the theologian, but he said the gospel is sneaky. God saw that we tend to worship man, so God became a man. You hear the rhetoric? You're like, oh, that's great. That's good.
That's, man, wow.
So it sounds like you've also been on a journey of exploring some of that too.
Oh, yes.
What's that done for you? How has that reframed it?
Yeah. I mean, like I think we've been talking about it, it's so much lighter and less from a place of fear. And, I don't have to, feel anxiety or fear or condemnation for exploring things and questioning. And, I love David, the Psalms and how much he was questioning and crying out to God, it's relationship, be honest.
Sure.
There might be times of silence. You don't always get the answers. And, I don't think the purpose is to get all the answers, but, how can you make that practical in your daily life? And what people are different places, and that's okay. And how can I have a living relationship with this person wherever they're at and where I'm at, and also the more I can love my past self or where I was, the more I can love others wherever they are. And yeah,
it's a better gospel, man.
Yes,
I think what we've been shown, and I think a lot of it's unintentional. I really think so. It's not all malicious. I think we think we really should do another episode on spiral dynamics in depth.
Oh yeah, love it.
Do like 5 minutes on each of them, but we are prone to interpret our Christianity through what level of maturity we are at, and then we project onto Christianity our maturity, not realizing it's actually far beyond us all. And so we've made the gospel, we've made Christianity far smaller and far limited and far more fragmented than it really is. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I talk about this with like college students, and they get it, man. They're like, this sounds like good news. They're like, I was teaching a class a few weeks ago, and on the way out, I was erasing chalk from the board, and one of my students yelled out loud, "This class is lit." She's 20. And people are like millennials and Gen Z or iGen. They don't care about this. I'm like, no, they do. It's just what you're presenting them on a core level. They know that what you're trying to offer them should be rejected. But they can't, they don't have words for it yet. And so can you really say somebody denied the gospel or denied Jesus or said no to Jesus when they were given a faulty view of Jesus anyways?
Yeah,
they are right to reject that. You know?
Yeah, man, that's great. Oh man, this has been so great. So many good gems, and I just love how you put symbols, and you go to the Greek. You talk about church history. You put everything together really well in a way that I can't. So I'm just like, let me give it to John, and you go for it.
Thank you. That's kind. What do you think's been what do you think's been really interesting from our conversation just now? I know you're supposed to be interviewing me, but I'm like a one-to-one person. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you offer that alternate way of looking at the gospel, and we don't just have to reject it or see it this way. And it becomes so much more alive and meaningful and helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you. This is a real treat, man. I was looking forward to it all week. So put me in a good mood for the rest of the day. Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, same here. I really appreciate you coming on, and I look forward to our next episode.
That's awesome. All right. Thanks, man.
All right.